wind in Cotton Ridge, Montana, had a way of getting under your skin. It wasn't the clean, sharp cut of a razor, but the persistent scrape of a dull knife. A wind that carried the grit of the sun-scorched plains and the bone-deep chill of the distant Absaroka Mountains. It was a wind that promised a long, dry season in this summer of 1886, turning the grasslands to the color of old straw and making the single dusty road of the town a river of pale, choking powder. The town itself was little more than a pause on the vast, empty page of the territory. There was a saloon, Cora's Place, which doubled as a general store, a post office that was hardly ever open, and a livery stable that smelled of horse sweat and hay. Law was a thin, frayed thread in the form of one overworked deputy, Tom Reyes. It was the kind of place where survival was a quiet, daily negotiation with the land, and trouble was a shadow that lengthened with the setting sun. That shadow had a name, the Black Spur Gang. They haunted the mail coach routes, their leader, Jasper Pike, a rumor spoken in low tones, a man whose greed was said to be as wide and empty as the plains themselves. Evelyn Hart knew the wind and the land better than she knew most people. At 19, her world was the small, weathered ranch her father had built and her mother now clung to. She sat on the top rail of the corral fence, a length of worn leather in her hands, methodically mending a bridle. Her father's old hunting rifle leaned against the post beside her, as much a part of her daily attire as her scuffed boots and faded gingham dress. She had enough schooling to read the labels on canned goods and the letters that occasionally came from a cousin back east. But her real education had come from the back of a horse and the sights of a rifle. She knew how to track a deer, how to read a storm in the clouds, and how to make a single bullet count. People in town sometimes whispered about the Hart girl, the one who was handier with a firearm than a needle. They didn't understand that for a woman running a ranch with a sick mother, a rifle wasn't a choice, it was an answer. Her hands, though slender, were calloused and capable. She finished her stitch, tested the leather with a firm tug, and her gaze drifted toward the small cabin. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a fragile signal of life against the immense, indifferent blue of the sky. Inside, her mother, May, would be resting. The cough had taken hold of her last winter and refused to let go, leaving her frail as a dry leaf. The doctor from Miles City had called it consumption, a word that felt like a death sentence whispered on the wind. It was the reason Evelyn worked from sunup to sundown, the reason she patched and mended and hunted. It was for May, for this small patch of unforgiving land that was their only home. A flicker of movement on the horizon drew her eye. A lone rider, heading east toward town. It wasn't an uncommon sight, but something about this rider held her attention. He didn't ride like a town man, stiff and uncertain. He rode as if he were part of the horse, a seamless union of man and beast, moving with an easy, practiced grace. Even from this distance, she could see he was tall in the saddle, a drifter, most likely, a cowboy moving between ranches, or maybe a man running from something. In this part of the country, it was usually one or the other. She watched until he was just a speck against the shimmering heat haze, then slid off the fence. The chickens needed feeding, and the wind was picking up again. Later that afternoon, Evelyn rode her buckskin mare, Daisy, into Cotton Ridge. She tied the horse to the hitching post in front of Cora's place, the wood worn smooth by countless rains. The bell above the door gave a cheerful, tinny jingle as she entered, a sound oddly out of place in the grim silence of the town. The air inside was thick with the smells of sawdust, stale beer, and Cora's strong lye soap. Cora stood behind the long, scarred bar, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She was a woman built like a sturdy oak barrel, with a face that had seen too many harsh winters and a gaze that missed nothing. Her saloon was the heart of Cotton Ridge, the place where news, gossip, and trouble all came to drink. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Cora said, her voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Come for your mother's tonic, honey. And some flour, if you have any left." Evelyn replied, pulling a small, cloth-bound list from her pocket. The mail coach get through all right. Cora snorted, a sound like rocks grinding together. Barely. The Black Spur boys paid it a visit just past Willow Creek. Didn't take the mail. Just the strong box. Jasper Pike's getting bolder. They say he's working for that railroad man, Bellamy, putting the squeeze on folks to sell their land cheap before the tracks come through. Arthur Bellamy. The name left a sour taste in Evelyn's mouth. He was a man who dressed in fine suits and smiled while he cheated you. He'd come through months ago, talking about progress and prosperity, but all he'd brought was fear. Folks are scared. Cora, Evelyn said quietly, leaning against the bar. They're selling for pennies. Fear's a cheap currency to buy land with, Cora agreed, her eyes hard. It's a shame, is what it is. A crying shame. She paused, her expression softening as she looked at Evelyn. How's your mother doing? The same. Some days are better than others. You tell May I'll be out to visit in a day or two. I made a pot of that strong broth she likes. She'd appreciate that. As Cora turned to get the tonic from a high shelf, the Batwing doors swung open and Deputy Tom Reyes walked in. He was a good man, earnest and honest, but his face was permanently etched with the worry of a man trying to hold back a flood with a single sandbag. He nodded to Evelyn, his gaze tired. Afternoon, Evelyn. Cora. Tom, Cora greeted him. What's the trouble now? Or is this a social call? The stage driver gave a description of one of the men who hit them, Tom said, ignoring her jab. Said he had a nasty scar shaped like a half-moon on his left cheek. Doesn't match anyone we know. They're drifters. Tom, Cora said, setting the tonic and a sack of flour on the bar. Pike hires gunslingers who are happy to do his dirty work and disappear. You know that. I know, the deputy sighed, running a hand through his dusty hair. Doesn't make it any easier to catch them. Just then, a few cowboys from the Triple Bar Ranch swaggered in, their spurs jingling on the wooden floor. They were loud and boisterous, their faces flushed from the sun and cheap whiskey. One of them, a lanky fellow named Pete, grinned at Evelyn. Well now, if it ain't the little sharpshooter, he drawled. Heard you took down a buck from 200 yards last week. A woman ought to be worrying about her stitching, not her aim. His friends chuckled. Evelyn felt a familiar flush of irritation, but she kept her voice even. When a needle and thread can put food on the table, Pete, I'll be sure to give it my full attention. Until then, I'll stick with what works. Cora shot Pete a glare that could have curdled milk. Leave the girl alone. Pete, she's forgotten more about surviving out here than you'll ever know. The cowboy held up his hands in mock surrender and moved toward the far end of the bar. Evelyn paid Cora for her supplies, the coins cool against her palm. She hated the way they looked at her, the way they talked about her, as if being a woman and being capable were two things that couldn't possibly exist in the same body. As she was stowing her supplies in her saddlebags, the rider she'd seen earlier passed by on the street. He was closer now, and she could see him more clearly. He was about 27 or so, with broad shoulders and a quiet, self-contained air about him. His face was lean and weathered, his jaw set in a firm line. He wore the simple, durable clothes of a working cowboy, clean but well worn. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, briefly met hers. There was no challenge in them, no judgment, just a steady, assessing look. She noticed a thin, white scar that ran from his temple down his cheek, disappearing into his collar. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod and rode on, heading for the livery. Evelyn finished securing her things and mounted Daisy. The encounter was nothing, a fleeting moment with a stranger. Yet it stuck with her. He hadn't looked at her like she was a curiosity. He had looked at her like she was just a person, like him. It was a rare feeling in Cotton Ridge. The ride home was quiet, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was fierce, almost violent, a reminder of the untamed nature of this land. As she neared the ranch, She saw the soft yellow glow of the lamp in the window. Her mother was awake. The sight filled her with a familiar mix of love and dread. It was a fragile light in an overwhelming darkness, a small flame of hope that she had to protect at all costs. She unsaddled Daisy, gave her a good brushing and a measure of oats, and then walked toward the cabin, the rifle in the crook of her arm and the sack of flour slung over her shoulder. The wind was still blowing, whispering through the dry grass, a constant, lonely sound. It spoke of hardship, of dust, and of long nights. But tonight, as Evelyn looked at the light in the window, she heard something else in it too. It was the sound of a promise she had made to herself, a promise to endure, to fight, and to hold on to this small, precious piece of the world, no matter what came down that long, dusty road. A few days later, a small herd of longhorns, maybe 50 head, drifted into the valley south of Cotton Ridge. They moved like a slow, brown river, guided by the same lone rider Evelyn had seen before. His name was Cole McKinnon, and he was looking for a place to water his cattle before pushing on east. The animals were his savings, the culmination of 2 years working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, a moving stake he hoped to sell for a fair price in the boom towns near the new railroad lines. He left the herd in a box canyon with good grass and a trickling spring, and rode into town for salt and coffee. It was midday, and the sun beat down with a white, hammering intensity. The street was nearly empty, in front of the post office. However, a small drama was unfolding. Arthur Bellamy, the railroad contractor, stood on the boardwalk, his tailored gray vest and polished boots an affront to the dust and grime of the town. He was speaking in a low, reasonable tone to a woman in a faded black dress, Martha Gable, whose husband had been taken by fever the previous spring. She was clutching a piece of paper, her face a mask of confusion and despair. "It's quite simple," Martha, Bellamy said, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "The loan your late husband took out is past due. This document transfers the deed to the railway company, clearing your debt entirely. It's a generous offer. It saves you from foreclosure." Cole had stopped at the town trough to let his horse drink, and he couldn't help but overhear. He knew Bellamy by reputation, a man who built his fortune on the misfortunes of others. "But we never took out such a large loan," Martha Gable stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "Just a small one, for seed, and we paid most of it back." "The interest, my dear woman, the interest compounds," Bellamy said with a patient, condescending smile. He gestured to 2 rough-looking men lounging on the saloon porch. One of them had a cruel, half-moon scar on his cheek. They were watching the exchange with lazy disinterest, but their presence was a clear threat. "You just sign here, and all your troubles will be over." Cole tied his reins to the hitching post and walked over, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't look at Bellamy, but at the paper in the woman's trembling hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "would you mind if I took a look at that?" Bellamy's smile tightened. "This is a private business matter. Cowboy." Cole ignored him, his gray eyes fixed on Mrs. Gable. She looked from Bellamy's cold face to Cole's calm one, and, after a moment's hesitation, handed him the document. Cole wasn't a lawyer, but he'd seen enough crooked contracts to recognize one. The print was small, the language convoluted, and the interest rate was high enough to be theft. "This says you owe $500, Cole said, looking back at the widow. "Is that what you borrowed for seed?" She shook her head frantically.
"No, it was $50. We paid back $30.
Cole folded the paper and handed it back to her. "Then I wouldn't sign it." He finally turned to face Bellamy, his expression unreadable. "This isn't a contract, it's a swindle." Bellamy's face darkened, the charming facade dropping away. "You have no right to interfere. This is a matter for the law." "The law," Cole said with a humorless half-smile. "From what I hear, you own the law in this town, but you don't own every man who rides through it." The 2 men on the porch straightened up, their hands moving closer to their pistols. Jasper Pike paid them to ensure Bellamy's business dealings went smoothly. This was not smooth. "You're making a mistake, friend," the scarred man warned, his voice a low growl. Cole didn't even glance his way. He just held Bellamy's gaze. "Ma'am," he said to the widow, "you go on home. Don't you sign anything." Terrified but emboldened, Martha Gable scurried away, clutching the fraudulent contract. Bellamy stared at Cole, his eyes glittering with cold fury.
You'll regret this,
he hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I'm dealing with a man in a fancy vest trying to cheat a widow out of her home," Cole replied evenly. "Doesn't seem too complicated to me." He turned his back on them and walked toward Cora's saloon, the feeling of two pairs of hostile eyes burning into his spine. He had just bought himself a whole heap of trouble. That same morning, Evelyn rode into town with a few dollars saved from selling jerky to a passing survey crew. She needed to send a wire to Helena, to a doctor who specialized in lung ailments, to see if there was any new medicine for her mother. The telegraph office was a small, stuffy room tacked onto the side of the post office, where the town's only banker, Mr. Harris, also kept a small desk. Harris was a nervous, balding man who always seemed to be sweating. No matter the weather, when Evelyn explained what she needed, he avoided her eyes. That's a fine thought." "Evelyn," he stammered, shuffling papers on his desk. "A fine thought. But there's a small matter we must discuss first." A knot of apprehension tightened in Evelyn's stomach. "What matter, Mr. Harris?" He finally looked at her, his expression pained. "It's about your family's deed. It's being held by the bank as collateral." Evelyn stared at him, uncomprehending. "Collateral? For what? We don't have any loans." "I'm afraid you do," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He pulled a folder from a drawer and opened it. He pushed a document across the desk. It was a loan agreement for $200, taken out 6 months ago. At the bottom was a signature May Hart. Evelyn picked it up. She knew her mother's hand as well as her own. The elegant, slightly shaky script. This was not it. This was a crude, clumsy imitation. A forgery. "My mother never signed this," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "The signature is on the paper," Harris said miserably. "Mr. Bellamy holds the note. He has instructed me to begin foreclosure proceedings if the first payment isn't made by the end of the week." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Bellamy, the railroad, the pressure on landowners. It wasn't just happening to others. It was happening to them. A cold, hard anger rose in her, pushing aside the fear. Her father had broken his back on that land. Her mother was fighting for every breath in that cabin. And this man, this snake in a starched vest, thought he could just steal it with a drop of ink. "This is a lie," she said, her voice firm. She pushed the paper back at him. "And we won't be paying it." She turned and walked out, her back straight, her mind racing. The world had suddenly shrunk, its dangers no longer distant rumors but a shadow falling directly over her home. Later that day, Cole McKinnon pushed his small herd out of the canyon, heading for the open range. He was uneasy. The town had felt wrong, rotten from the inside. He kept scanning the rocky ridges that bordered the plains, his hand never far from the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He'd learned long ago on the frontier that making enemies was easy. Surviving them was the hard part. The attack came as he was moving through a narrow pass, the rocks rising high on either side. 2 rifle shots echoed in the enclosed space, one kicking up dust just in front of his horse, the other splintering the rock near his head. The cattle panicked, scattering in every direction. Cole swung his horse around, pulling his Winchester from its scabbard as 2 riders appeared on the ridge above him. It was Bellamy's men, the one with the scar and his companion. "Shoulda kept riding, Cowboy!" the scarred man shouted, leveling his rifle. Cole fired back, not aiming to hit but to keep their heads down. He was pinned. There was no cover, and he was outnumbered. He urged his horse back, trying to get out of the pass, but another rider appeared, blocking his retreat. 3 of them. They weren't trying to kill him. Not yet. They were toying with him, scaring his herd, intending to leave him afoot and ruined. Evelyn was half a mile away, tracking a rabbit for the stew pot, when she heard the gunshots. Her first instinct was to drop low, to make herself small and unseen. But the sound wasn't the single, clean shot of a hunter. It was a volley, sharp and angry. Peeking over a rise, she saw the scene laid out below the scattered cattle, the lone rider trapped in the pass, and the 3 men closing in. She recognized the lone rider. It was the stranger from town, the one who had looked at her like an equal. Her heart pounded. This wasn't her fight. Getting involved was madness. She had her mother to think of, but as she watched, seeing the grim certainty on the faces of the ambushers, something inside her rebelled. It was the same cold anger she'd felt in the banker's office. This was Bellamy's work. This was what happened when men like him were allowed to operate without consequence. She raised her father's rifle, the stock familiar and steady against her shoulder. She wasn't a killer, but she knew how to send a message. She didn't aim for any of the men. She aimed for the large, precariously balanced rock formation directly above the 2 men on the ridge. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The report was deafening. The bullet struck the rock face with a sharp crack, and a cascade of shale and dust rained down on the 2 ambushers. They yelled in surprise and alarm, their horses rearing. They had no idea where the shot had come from, if they were suddenly surrounded. The 3rd man, the one blocking the pass, turned in confusion. It was the opening Cole needed. He spurred his horse forward, firing a single shot that made the man's horse shy violently. And then he was through, galloping out onto the open plain. The ambushers, spooked and disorganized, fired a few wild shots after him before deciding to retreat. Evelyn stayed hidden until they were gone, her heart still hammering against her ribs. Then, cautiously, she mounted Daisy and rode down into the pass. Cole had reined in his horse a few hundred yards out, his rifle still in his hands, watching the riders disappear. When he saw Evelyn approaching, he raised the Winchester slightly, his eyes narrowed and wary. She stopped a respectable distance away.
They're gone,
she said, her voice calm despite her racing pulse. He lowered the rifle, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the old hunting rifle she carried. That was your shot. She just nodded. He rode closer, stopping beside her. You took a hell of a risk. So did you, back in town, she countered. Seems like making enemies of Arthur Bellamy's becoming a local pastime. He looked at her for a long moment, his stormy eyes assessing her. I owe you my thanks. No, you don't, she said, turning Daisy's head. Just be more careful who you pick fights with. This is a hard country for a man on his own. She started to ride away, but his voice stopped her. Wait, they'll be watching the main trail. They might come back. She paused, considering he was right. There's another way, she said reluctantly. A game trail through the rocks. It'll bring you out on the other side of this valley, where you can find good cover. He fell into place beside her as she led him toward a barely visible opening in the rock wall. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the clatter of their horses' hooves on the stone. Around here, Evelyn said finally, breaking the quiet. A horse trusts the wind more than a stranger. It was a warning, a way of drawing a line. Cole looked at her, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. And I trust you more than men in starched vests. The words hung in the air between them. A simple statement of fact that felt more significant than it should. It was an acknowledgement of a shared world, a shared understanding of who the real enemies were. He saw in her not just a girl with a gun, but a woman of quiet strength and fierce self-respect, the kind he hadn't seen in a long time. And she saw in him not just another drifting cowboy, but a man whose silence held more honor than all of Bellamy's eloquent lies. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that looked like the fingers of a grasping hand reaching across the land. For the first time in the heart of that danger, neither of them felt entirely alone. The air in Cotton Ridge had grown thick with unspoken threats. After Cole McKinnon's public defiance of Arthur Bellamy, a tension settled over the town, palpable as the heat rising from the baked earth. People looked at each other with wary eyes, and whispers followed anyone who lingered too long on the boardwalk. Evelyn felt it when she rode in 3 days later for the medicine Cora had ordered for her from Miles City. The triple-bar cowboys, usually quick with a crude joke, merely nodded and looked away. Mr. Harris, the banker, saw her coming and quickly disappeared into a back room. The town was holding its breath, waiting for the other boot to drop. Cora wrapped the small, precious bottle of laudanum in a thick cloth and passed it over the bar. "You be careful on the ride home." "Evelyn," she said, her voice low, "I've seen some of Pike's men lingering at the edge of town. They're not here for the scenery." "I'm always careful." "Cora," Evelyn replied, tucking the bottle safely into her saddlebag. "This is different," Cora insisted, her dark eyes serious. "That cowboy, McKinnon, he stirred up a hornet's nest. Bellamy won't let that stand, and now Pike's men are sniffing around. They're looking for him." A cold knot formed in Evelyn's stomach. She hadn't seen Cole since she'd shown him the game trail. She'd hoped he was long gone, miles away, taking his trouble with him. She had enough of her own. She thanked Cora, mounted Daisy, and started for home, pushing the mare into a steady trot, eager to leave the town's suffocating atmosphere behind. The trail home wound through a series of sun-bleached canyons, the rock walls rising up like ancient, crumbling bones. The afternoon sun beat down, and the air was still and hot, thick with the smell of dust and dry sage. It was in the second canyon, a narrow passage known for its treacherous footing and deep red dust, that she heard it, the frantic, desperate pounding of hooves, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire. Her blood ran cold. She pulled Daisy behind a towering slab of granite that had calved off the canyon wall ages ago. Dismounting and peering cautiously around the edge, a cloud of red dust boiled at the far end of the canyon, and out of it burst a single rider. It was Cole. He was leaning low over his horse's neck, his face grim, his hat gone. Behind him, maybe 100 yards back, were 4 more riders. Jasper Pike was in the lead, his cruel, narrow face set in a predator's grin. They weren't trying for a clean shot. They were herding him, driving him deeper into the canyon where the walls closed in and there was no escape. Evelyn's mind screamed at her to stay hidden, to let them pass. This was his fight. Bringing this violence home to her mother was her greatest fear, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She saw the exhaustion in the set of Cole's shoulders, the way his horse was starting to labor. He was being run to ground like a wolf, and there was no honor in it. It was the same ugly power that was trying to steal her home, the same callous disregard for a person's life. Cole saw her a second before he reached the granite slab. His eyes widened in disbelief and warning. He pulled his horse up sharply, sliding to a halt in the deep dust and swinging down, using the massive rock for cover. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard just as Pike and his men galloped closer, slowing their pace, savoring the moment. "Nowhere left to run," Cowboy Jasper Pike shouted, his voice echoing off the rock. "Should have minded your own business." Evelyn didn't hesitate. It wasn't a choice made with her mind, but with her gut, an instinct as pure and fierce as a mother bear defending her cub. She ran from behind Daisy, her own rifle in hand, and dropped to a crouch beside Cole behind the rock. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his face tight with anger and fear for her. "Get out of here." "There's no time," she said, her voice steady. She took in the situation in a single, practiced glance. Pike and his men were fanning out, getting ready to flank them. They were exposed on one side, They'll be on us in a second." Without another word, she did something that defied all logic of a gunfight. She stood up, moving directly in front of him. For a split second, she was a clear target against the sunlit rock. With a swift, fluid motion, she unfastened her heavy wool cloak and, holding it open, used its dark, billowing fabric to shield his position from view, creating a shifting, unpredictable shadow where a man had just been.
What in God's name?
Cole started to say, utterly bewildered. From within the dark folds of her own cloak, Evelyn raised her rifle. She wasn't aiming at a man. She was aiming at the chaos she needed to create. She fired. The first shot struck the canyon wall just above the head of the man to Pike's right. Rock chips flew like angry hornets, and his horse screamed and reared, throwing him into the dust. Before they could recover from the shock of a shot coming from such an impossible place, she shifted her aim and fired again. The second bullet tore through the fleshy part of another man's shoulder. He cried out, dropping his rifle and grabbing the wound, his face a mask of pained surprise. It was all the opening they needed. The carefully laid trap was broken, the hunters suddenly confused and on the defensive. Now Evelyn yelled, dropping her cloak and diving back behind the rock. Cole was already moving. He laid down 2 quick covering shots that sent Pike and his remaining men scrambling for cover. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward his horse. "Come on." He vaulted into the saddle and hauled her up behind him, her arms instinctively wrapping around his waist for balance. He kicked the horse into a desperate, lunging gallop, heading back the way he'd come, away from the disorganized gang. Behind them, Jasper Pike rose from behind a rock, his face black with fury. He raised his pistol, but they were already too far. A fleeing shape disappearing into the dust, he looked at his man on the ground, groaning and holding his shoulder. "That girl," Jasper snarled, his voice a low, venomous promise. "That girl will learn to be afraid." They didn't stop riding until the sounds of the canyon were far behind them and the sun was touching the jagged peaks of the mountains. Cole finally slowed the exhausted horse to a walk and slid from the saddle, helping Evelyn down. Her legs were shaky, and the adrenaline was leaving her in a cold rush. He stood before her, his hands on his hips, his face a mixture of awe and exasperation. That was the bravest, most fool thing I have ever seen in my life. "It worked," she said, her voice a little breathless. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You stood right in front of me." They weren't expecting it, she reasoned, trying to sound more confident than she felt. They were expecting a cowboy. Not that. He just shook his head, a long breath escaping him. He looked at her, at the dust on her face and the fierce light still burning in her eyes, and he felt a debt settle upon him, one heavier than any he had ever known. He insisted on escorting her the rest of the way home. When they arrived at the small, weathered cabin, the lamp was already lit in the window. May Hart stood in the doorway, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl, her face etched with worry. The sight of her daughter arriving behind a strange man on a single horse deepened the lines of concern. Evelyn quickly explained what happened, leaving out the most dangerous details but conveying enough to make her mother's hand fly to her mouth. Cole stood back, his hat in his hands, feeling like an intruder, a bringer of the very violence he knew this small family feared. "Ma'am," he said, stepping forward and addressing May, his voice quiet and respectful. "Your daughter saved my life today. I'm in her debt." The next morning, Cole was still there. He had slept in the barn, and when Evelyn came out at sunrise, she found him already at work, using their few spare pieces of lumber to reinforce a section of corral fence that had been threatening to collapse for months. "You don't have to do that," she said, stopping by the fence. "I believe I do," he replied without looking up from his work. "A debt is a debt." He paused, hammering a nail home with 2 clean strikes. "Besides, that water pump of yours is making a sound like a dying goose. I think I can fix it." And so he stayed, He was a quiet presence, a man who spoke with his hands more than his mouth. He was tireless, moving from one long-neglected task to another. He repaired the fence, dismantled and fixed the squealing water pump, patched a leak in the barn roof, and even rehung the cabin door so it no longer scraped against the floor. In the long, quiet evenings, a tentative routine formed. After May had gone to bed, they would sit on the small porch, the vast, star-filled sky stretching out above them. It was then that he started to teach her how to read the sky. He showed her how to find the North Star, how the position of the Big Dipper told the time of night. He pointed out the faint, milky band of the galaxy. "When you're on a cattle drive, the sky is your map and your clock," he told her one night, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. "You learn to read the clouds, too. See those thin, wispy ones up high? They're called mare's tails. Mean a change in the weather is coming. Wind, most likely." He spoke of a world she'd only ever seen from her small patch of land, a world of vast distances and constant movement. And as she listened, she began to teach him things in return, without either of them realizing it. He learned to read the silences of the kitchen. He watched her knead dough for the next day's bread, her movements efficient and rhythmic. He saw the way she prepared her mother's tonic, her hands gentle and sure. He noticed the unspoken understanding that passed between mother and daughter in a single glance. He was learning the language of home, a language of care and constancy that was entirely foreign to him. He saw the strength it took to maintain this small, fragile bubble of peace in such a harsh world. But beneath the quiet companionship, a current of fear ran through them both. Evelyn would watch her mother sleeping, her breathing shallow, and a wave of guilt would wash over her. She had invited Jasper Pike's attention. She had painted a target on their backs. Every strange sound in the night made her flinch, her hand reaching for the rifle that was never far away. Cole felt his own kind of fear. He found himself looking forward to the evenings on the porch, to the comfortable silence of working alongside her during the day. He was starting to feel the pull of this place, the dangerous lure of putting down roots. But his past was a ghost that walked beside him. He remembered another time, another friend he'd failed to protect. Staying here felt like a lie, like pretending he was a man who could build things instead of one who brought trouble. To stay would be to bind himself to them, and he felt like a storm cloud that would only bring lightning down on their small, hopeful home. The thought of leaving was a sharp pain, but the thought of staying felt like an even greater betrayal. The quiet rhythm Cole and Evelyn had found was a fragile thing, a soap bubble shimmering in a world of sharp edges. The first prick came in the form of a rider from town, a boy from the livery stable, who delivered a folded, official-looking paper. It was a notice of foreclosure from the Cotton Ridge Bank, formal and cold, giving them 7 days to settle a debt of $200 or vacate the property. The forged signature that had started it all was now a legally binding threat. Mayhart read the paper, and a fit of coughing seized her, so violent it left her pale and trembling in her chair. Evelyn stood beside her, one hand on her mother's shoulder, her gaze fixed on the endless, indifferent prairie outside the window. The fight was no longer a distant possibility. It was on their doorstep. Cole, who had been oiling a harness on the porch, saw the look on Evelyn's face when she came back outside. He didn't need to ask. He simply put down the leather and the oil rag. "Bellamy," he said. It wasn't a question. "He's using the bank now," Evelyn confirmed, her voice tight and brittle. "We have a week." A grim silence settled between them. A week was an eternity, and no time at all. That same day, news of a different kind drifted out from town. Deputy Tom Reyes had ridden out 2 days prior, supposedly tracking a horse thief, and had not returned. His horse had been found wandering, its saddlebags empty. No one said Jasper Pike's name aloud, but the implication was clear. With the law conveniently removed from the board, Bellamy and his cronies could operate with impunity. Cotton Ridge was now officially on its own. The town's fear, deprived of a legal outlet, turned inward and curdled into something ugly. The whispers started. Evelyn heard them the next time she rode in for supplies, a trip she now made with a sense of dread. She saw the women of the town clustered by the mercantile, their conversation stopping abruptly as she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and contempt. Pete, the lanky cowboy from the Triple Bar, saw her leaving Cora's and made a loud comment to his friends. See that the Hart girl's got herself a protector. Funny what a girl with a rifle can attract. A drifter with a fast horse and no name. His friends snickered. She uses that gun to do her talking. And I hear that cowboy is listening real close. The words were a physical blow, staining her cheeks with heat. They were twisting her act of survival into something shameful, something manipulative. They were taking her strength and refashioning it as a weapon against her own reputation. It was a different kind of siege, one of fences made of whispers and walls built of sideways glances. She rode home with her back straight, her jaw set, but the words followed her, insidious as the dust that settled on everything. Each evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Evelyn performed a small ritual. She would trim the wick of the oil lamp that sat on the table in the main room, fill its glass base with kerosene, and polish the chimney until it shone. When darkness fell, she would strike a match and touch it to the wick, and a soft, golden light would push back the shadows. The lamp had been her father's. It was a steady, unwavering light, and in the growing darkness that surrounded them, it became more than just a lamp. It was a symbol of their defiance, a small, flickering beacon of hope that declared they were still there, that the Hart home was not yet extinguished. Cole would watch her do it from the porch, seeing in the simple, careful act the same stubborn resilience he had seen in her in the canyon. He carried his own symbols, though they were etched into his skin, not lit on a table. One afternoon, as he was splitting wood, his shirt sleeve rode up, revealing a pale, jagged scar that circled his left wrist like a macabre bracelet. Evelyn, coming to call him for a meal, saw it and stopped. It was different from the scar on his face, which was a clean line, likely from a knife. This one was puckered and ugly. He saw her looking and instinctively pulled the sleeve down. A shadow passed over his face, closing him off. It was the first time she had asked him a personal question. How did you get that? He stared at the axe head for a long moment before answering, his voice low. It was a rope. He didn't elaborate, but the single word was freighted with a history he clearly had no intention of sharing. Later, though, as the silence of another tense evening stretched between them, he spoke of it. Not directly, but he told her a story, his eyes fixed on the distant, dark line of the mountains. He spoke of his time scouting for a cattle drive in the New Mexico territory, and of another young man, a boy of 18 named Jimmy, who was quick with a joke and faster with a grin. There had been trouble with a rancher, a powerful man who accused Jimmy of stealing a horse. It wasn't true, but the rancher had friends. They formed a posse. Cole had been there. He'd stood in the crowd, a teenager himself, his own gun feeling useless in his hand as they'd thrown a rope over a cottonwood branch. He'd watched, powerless, as they'd unjustly taken his friend's life. The rope slipped, Cole said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, his hand unconsciously going to his own wrist. The first time, it caught my arm. I tried to pull him back, to stop them, but I was just a kid. They pushed me away and did it again. He fell silent. He didn't need to explain the rest. He had spent the last decade trying to outrun the memory of his own helplessness, of the silence that followed the unforgivable act. Staying in one place, getting involved, felt like standing under that cottonwood tree all over again. The weight of his past and their perilous present filled the small cabin, making the air feel heavy and hard to breathe. That night, searching for something, anything, to break the oppressive quiet, Evelyn remembered a small wooden box her father had made. She pulled it out from under her mother's bed. It was filled with letters he had written to May during the 1 year he had spent working on the railroad farther north to earn enough money to buy their land. May was already asleep, her breathing a soft, shallow rustle in the next room. Evelyn sat at the table, in the warm circle of light from the oil lamp, and opened the first letter. Cole sat on the porch steps, just outside the open door, a silent silhouette against the starry sky. At first, Evelyn read to herself, but the words were so full of her father's voice, his simple, honest, loving voice, that she began to read them aloud, softly, as much for herself as for the quiet man listening in the darkness. Her father had been a blacksmith, a man of fire and steel, but his letters were gentle. He wrote of his loneliness, of the brutal work, but mostly he wrote of his dream for the home he would build for his wife. "The smell of coal and hot iron is in my clothes and in my hair," she read, her voice wavering slightly. "It is a good smell, the smell of work, but I dream of a different smell. May, I dream of a house where the scent of your baking bread is stronger than the smell of gun oil on my hands. A place where the sound of your laughter drowns out the clang of the hammer. I am not building a railroad. I am building that for you. A sweet home where the heart can be safe." Evelyn's voice broke on the last words. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek and fell onto the yellowed paper. She had not realized until that moment how desperately she missed him, how much she missed the feeling of safety he had represented. From the darkness on the porch, Cole's voice came, rougher and thicker than usual. "He was a good man. He was," she whispered, carefully folding the letter. "He believed a home was something you built with your hands and your heart, not something you stole with a forged signature." An uncomfortable silence fell, filled only by the chirping of crickets. They were both thinking the same thing. The sweet home her father had dreamed of, the one he had built with his sweat and love, was about to be torn from their grasp. The weight of it all, the foreclosure, the rumors, Jasper Pike's lingering threat, the memory of his own past failures settled on Cole. He looked at Evelyn, her face illuminated by the lamp's gentle glow, a study in fragile strength. The words came out of him before he had a chance to stop them. A sudden, impulsive dam break of emotion. "If there ever comes a day of peace," he said, his voice low and intense, "I will build it for you. For you and your mother. A sweet home, just like in the letter." Evelyn looked up, her tear-filled eyes wide with surprise. It was a wild, impossible promise, a dream spoken into a nightmare, but in the quiet sincerity of his voice, in the fierce protectiveness in his gaze, she heard something more than just words. It was a vow. It was the sound of a man choosing to stand his ground, to stop running. The wind had begun to shift, a cold northern edge sharpening its bite. It carried the first hint of snow, a promise of a new and harder season to come. The pace was quickening. The world outside their small circle of lamplight was moving faster, drawing them all toward an unavoidable confrontation. The promise hung in the air between them for 2 days, a fragile, impossible thing in a world that was steadily shrinking. The third night, the world caught fire. Evelyn was woken from a restless sleep not by a sound, but by a light, a malevolent orange glow that flickered against her window pane. She sat bolt upright, her heart seizing with a primal terror. The glow was coming from the direction of town. Cole was already outside, a silhouette against the lurid sky, staring toward the angry pulse of light on the horizon. "It's the town," he said, his voice a low, grim statement of fact as she came to stand beside him. The wind, which had been picking up all day, was now carrying the faint, acrid smell of smoke and a distant, chaotic sound of shouting. Without another word, they moved. Cole saddled both horses with a speed and efficiency that spoke of long practice in moments of crisis. Evelyn ran back inside to check on her mother, who was awake and clutching the quilt to her chin, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay inside. Lock the door," Evelyn commanded, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Don't open it for anyone." They rode hard, the orange glow growing brighter, resolving itself into a column of flame and smoke that clawed at the night sky. The town's grain storehouse, the repository of the entire valley's harvest and the key to surviving the coming winter, was burning. Flames licked from the windows and roared through the roof, sending a fountain of sparks up into the wind. The single street of Cotton Ridge was a scene of pandemonium. People ran back and forth with buckets, their efforts pathetically small against the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, and the roar of the fire was punctuated by the sharp crack of timbers giving way. Cole and Evelyn dismounted and tied their horses far down the street, grabbing 2 empty buckets from a wagon. "A bucket line," Cole yelled, his voice cutting through the din. "From the trough, we can't save the storehouse, but we can stop it from spreading to the livery." His authoritative voice, the voice of a man used to commanding others in desperate situations, cut through the panic. The men from the Triple Bar Ranch, who had been throwing water haphazardly, turned to him. Pete, the lanky cowboy who had mocked Evelyn, was the first to nod. "He's right, line up." They formed a ragged chain, from the horse trough to the side of the livery stable, passing buckets of precious water hand over hand. Evelyn found herself in line next to Cora, the saloon owner, her face streaked with soot, her powerful arms working with a steady, tireless rhythm. Cole stood closest to the flames, dousing the livery wall, his face a grim mask of determination against the flickering hellscape. For an hour, they fought the fire, a desperate, sweating, coughing battle against an implacable enemy. They saved the livery, but the grain storehouse was a total loss, collapsing into a mountain of glowing embers and black, skeletal beams. As the main blaze subsided, a cold, drizzling rain began to fall, hissing on the hot ashes and turning the dust to a slick, black mud. It was then that the new poison began to spread. A man Evelyn recognized as one of Bellamy's railroad crew, a foreman named Riggs, spoke up, his voice carrying in a lull in the chaos. "Funny, ain't it? The bank was about to take the Hart girl's place. A person might get awful angry about that, angry enough to do something crazy." A low murmur went through the exhausted, soot-stained crowd. Heads turned toward Evelyn. The whispers she had heard before now coalesced into a single, ugly accusation. Pete, the Triple Bar Cowboy, looked at her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. She does know her way around a firearm. Maybe she knows her way around a can of kerosene, too. The injustice of it was a physical shock, stealing Evelyn's breath. She had just worked alongside these people, fought to save their town, and now they were turning on her, their fear needing a target. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Cora boomed, stepping forward. "Evelyn Hart was here fighting this fire with the rest of us. Use your heads." But Arthur Bellamy chose that moment to appear, emerging from the shadows of the saloon porch, immaculately dressed as always, his face a mask of civic concern. "A terrible tragedy," he said, his smooth voice calming the crowd. "A terrible, terrible loss for us all. Of course, we must not jump to conclusions, but Riggs has a point. Desperate people do desperate things." He looked directly at Evelyn, a flicker of cold triumph in his eyes. He was using the fire he'd almost certainly started to cement her as the town pariah. Cole stepped away from the smoking wall of the livery, his eyes blazing with a cold fire of their own. "Before you all start looking for a rope," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "maybe you should look at the ground." He strode over to the back of the burned-out building, near a rear door that had been forced open. He knelt in the mud, which had preserved the ground beneath a slight overhang. A fire this hot, started this fast, takes more than one person. It takes a crew that came in from the back. He pointed. "Look here." In the soft, wet earth were several distinct boot prints, different from the worn, plain heels of the local ranchers. One print was particularly clear, showing a deep, crescent-shaped gouge in the heel and a star pattern made of hobnails. It was the signature print of a custom boot, the kind a man who spent a lot of money on his gear might wear, a gang leader. "I've seen that print before," one of the older Triple Bar hands said slowly. "Up near the pass. That's the mark of Jasper Pike's boots." A wave of understanding and renewed fear passed through the crowd. This wasn't the act of a vengeful girl, it was the work of the Black Spur Gang. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Bellamy saw his narrative slipping away and moved quickly to regain control. "Pike is a menace, to be sure," he said smoothly. "But who's to say he wasn't hired? This is a matter for the law. When we have one." He turned his attention to the crowd, his voice full of false generosity. "But the immediate need is to recover. The railroad will, of course, donate a fund to help rebuild and to provide grain for those who have lost everything. We must stand together in this time of crisis." It was a masterful move, buying their silence with his money, turning them from the inconvenient truth toward the comforting promise of a handout. The crowd wavered, caught between their fear of Pike and their immediate need. It was then that Evelyn found her voice. She walked past Cole and stood on the bottom step of the mercantile, facing the townspeople. Her hair was damp and plastered with soot. Her dress was torn, but her gaze was clear and steady. She did not raise her voice. "Mr. Bellamy is right," she said, and a surprised silence fell. "We do need to stand together. In the West, we live by each other. That's the only law that matters when the night is dark. My family is about to lose its home because of a piece of paper. Tonight, you all lost your harvest because of a fire." She paused, her eyes moving from one familiar face to another. "If you let a lie stand because it's easier, if you stay silent because you're afraid, you have to ask yourself one question." She let the silence hang in the drizzling rain. "Whose house will burn tomorrow?" No one answered. They couldn't meet her eyes. They just stood in the muddy street, in the ruin of their own security. And for the first time, they understood that the threat to the Hart Ranch and the threat to the town were one and the same. The crowd dispersed slowly, sullenly, leaving Evelyn and Cole standing in the rain. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. The stable, which had been spared, offered the only nearby shelter. They led their horses inside, the air thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay and leather. The rain pattered softly on the roof, a gentle sound after the roar of the fire. They stood in the shadows, not speaking, listening to the horses shifting in their stalls. Evelyn began to tremble, a delayed reaction to the horror of the night, to the fire and the accusation. Cole saw it and took a step closer. He didn't reach for her, but he was a solid, warm presence in the darkness.
"I should have known he would do this,"
Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper.
"Use me, turn everyone against me."
"It's not you they're afraid of," Cole said. "It's him. He's got them so tangled up in fear and debt they can't see straight." She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the shaking. Their hands brushed in the darkness. His was rough and calloused, hers trembling. For a moment, their fingers intertwined. A brief, startling connection of warmth and shared vulnerability. It wasn't a lover's touch, but something deeper, an anchor in the storm. He cleared his throat, letting his hand drop, but the connection lingered in the air between them. He looked up at the sturdy rafters of the barn roof, listening to the steady rain. "You covered my back from the bandits," he said, his voice a low, rough promise. "I'll cover your roof." It was a simple, stark pledge, as solid and unadorned as the man who spoke it. It wasn't just about the leak in her cabin roof he had patched a few days before. It was about everything. It was the promise of shelter, of safety, of a sweet home, made in the muddy, smoky aftermath of destruction. Later, as the rain subsided and a watery dawn began to break, Cole's restless energy wouldn't let him be still. He told Evelyn he wanted to check the railroad warehouse, to see if Bellamy had any spare tarps they could use to cover the exposed goods in the mercantile. It was an excuse. He needed to see the heart of his enemy's operation. The warehouse was a long, low building near the future site of the depot. The manager, a twitchy man named Finch, was overseeing the loading of a wagon. Cole recognized the driver as a man known to associate with the Black Spur Gang. Finch was nervously checking a list on a clipboard. "That's the last of it," Finch said, his voice hushed. "2 crates of the 44 to 40S and one of the 30 to 30S, just like Mr." Bellamy ordered. "You tell Pike this is the final shipment. It's getting too risky." Cole froze in the shadows of the loading dock. Ammunition. Bellamy wasn't just using Pike's reputation for fear. He was actively supplying his gang. He was arming the very men who were terrorizing the valley. He looked at the ledger Finch was holding. It was a list of railroad supplies, but the quantities of cartridges were coded as drilling components. It was the link, the first piece of hard, legal proof that tied the man in the fancy vest directly to the man with the star-patterned boots. The fire had been meant to break the town's spirit, but it had just exposed the enemy's flank. The fight was no longer just about a small ranch. It was about everything. The sky had been a bruised, unsettling gray for a day and a night. The mare's tails Cole had pointed out had thickened into a solid, oppressive ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the plains, stealing the color from the landscape. Then, the snow began. It came not as gentle flakes, but as a hard, driving onslaught of white, hurled from the north by a wind that screamed like a banshee. The world dissolved into a churning vortex of white. Visibility dropped to a few feet. It was a blizzard, the kind that erased trails, buried landmarks, and isolated every living thing in a cold, suffocating embrace. Inside the small cabin, the oil lamp burned, its golden light a fragile shield against the raging storm. May was bundled in every blanket they owned, her cough a dry, rattling counterpoint to the howl of the wind. Cole had spent the day securing the barn, checking on the horses, and reinforcing the shutters on the cabin. He and Evelyn moved in a tense, shared silence, both knowing the storm was more than just weather. It was cover. The attack came just after dusk, when the world was a maelstrom of black and white. They didn't hear them ride up. The wind swallowed every sound. The first warning was the splintering crash of the cabin door being kicked in. It flew open, slamming against the interior wall, and a blast of snow and wind tore through the room, nearly extinguishing the lamp. Jasper Pike stood in the doorway, a human-shaped hole in the blizzard, snow clinging to his long duster. Behind him were 3 of his men, their faces obscured by scarves, their guns already drawn. "Evening, folks," Pike said, his voice a mocking drawl that cut through the wind's shriek. "Sorry to intrude. We're looking for the brave cowboy. Seems he has something that belongs to my business partner." Cole had been standing by the hearth. In the instant the door burst open, he had moved, shoving Evelyn behind him and pushing her toward the back room where her mother was. His hand was already on his Colt. "Get your mother," he ordered in a low, urgent voice. "Go out the back window. Run for the rocks." "No," Evelyn whispered, her hand instinctively going to the rifle she had left leaning against the wall. "Go," he snarled, a command of such desperate finality that it broke through her paralysis. Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "There's nowhere to run. Girlie, we want the cowboy, and we want the proof he thinks he has. We figure you're the best way to get both." One of Pike's men lunged for Evelyn. Cole fired, not at the man, but at the floorboards in front of him. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. Splinters flew, and the man recoiled. It was the only distraction Cole needed. He shoved the heavy oak table over, creating a barricade, and grabbed Evelyn's rifle from the wall, thrusting it into her hands. The window. Now, while Evelyn scrambled into her mother's room, Cole provided covering fire, the roar of his Colt answering the shots from Pike's men. Bullets tore through the thin cabin walls, shattering a jar on the mantelpiece and punching holes in the flour bin. He knew they couldn't stay. Pike wouldn't burn the cabin. He needed Evelyn alive, but they would be trapped. Evelyn helped her terrified mother out the small back window into the teeth of the blizzard. The cold was a physical shock, stealing their breath. The old wash. "Mama," Evelyn shouted over the gale. "Follow the fence line. Hide." She watched for a heart-stopping second as her mother's frail form was swallowed by the driving snow, then turned back. She would not leave Cole. He came tumbling out the window a moment later, landing in the deep snow beside her. "I told you to run," he yelled, grabbing her arm. "They'll track you," she yelled back. "They'll follow your horse. We have to go through the canyon." It was madness, but she was right. Their only chance was to go where horses couldn't easily follow, to the narrow, treacherous canyon that cut through the hills behind the ranch. In the blizzard, it would be a death trap, but the cabin was already won. They ran, heads down against the stinging ice, the sounds of the gunfight fading behind them, replaced by the monolithic roar of the storm. They stumbled into the mouth of the canyon, the rock walls offering some meager shelter from the wind, but creating a new set of dangers. The ground was a slick, uneven sheet of ice, and the air was filled with a blinding, disorienting whiteness. They scrambled up a narrow game trail, their lungs burning, their hands and feet already numb. Below them, they heard shouts. Pike and his men had followed. On foot, their dark shapes appearing and disappearing in the swirling snow. They were being hunted. The chase led them deeper into the canyon, to a place where a rickety wooden bridge, once used by prospectors, spanned a deep, ice-choked chasm. On the far side of the bridge, a covered wagon was stranded, hopelessly stuck in a deep drift, a lantern swinging from its side, its light a feeble yellow smudge. A man and a woman were struggling to free their horses, their movements frantic with fear. Pike's men were closing in on them, seeing them as new leverage. "Split up," Pike yelled to his men. "You two, grab the farmers. We'll take the cowboy and the girl on the bridge." Cole and Evelyn reached the near side of the bridge. It was slick with ice, its ropes groaning under the weight of the new snow. "We have to cross," Cole said, his voice grim.
It's our only chance.
As they stepped onto the swaying bridge, Jasper Pike appeared on the path behind them, a pistol in each hand. "End of the line," he snarled. Cole pushed Evelyn behind him and drew his own gun, but on the far side of the chasm, Pike's two other men had reached the terrified couple by the wagon, grabbing the woman and holding a knife to her throat. Suddenly, Cole found himself in a version of his own worst nightmare, an innocent life held in the balance, and he was powerless. "Drop the gun, McKinnon," Pike ordered, "or the lady gets it." Cole's face was a stone mask, but Evelyn saw the agony in his eyes. He slowly, reluctantly, let his coat fall to the snow. Pike grinned and started walking toward them, his boots crunching on the icy path. It was in that moment of absolute despair that Evelyn saw it. High on the canyon wall, above the two men holding the farm couple, was a thick hemp rope, part of an old, abandoned mining rig. The rope was tied to a heavy iron anchor bolt driven into the rock, and it was holding back a massive, unstable drift of snow that had built up on a wide ledge. It was a snowslide waiting to happen. She had one shot. She couldn't shoot Pike without the farmers being harmed, but she could change the landscape. As Pike advanced on Cole, she raised her rifle. He was so focused on Cole he didn't see her shift her aim upward. She ignored the men, the wagon, the bridge. She focused on the frayed, thick rope where it met the iron ring. She fired. The bullet sang through the icy air and struck the rope anchor. The heavy rope, already strained, snapped with a loud crack. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then, with a low, guttural groan, the mountain of snow on the ledge gave way. It wasn't an avalanche of rock, but a thundering, suffocating river of white. It poured down the canyon wall, engulfing the two bandits and the wagon in a massive, silent wave. The woman's scream was cut short as she and her husband were swept away, buried along with their captors. The ground shuddered. Pike stopped, turning in stunned disbelief at the roaring tide of snow. The distraction was all Cole needed. He lunged forward, not for his gun, but for Pike himself. He slammed into the gang leader, and the two men went down in a brutal, tangled heap on the narrow, icy path at the edge of the chasm. They fought with a savage intensity, a battle of fists and desperation. Cole's raw strength against Pike's vicious, dirty tactics. They rolled perilously close to the edge, the blizzard raging around them. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the storm. A posse of riders, maybe 10 of them, appeared at the canyon mouth. Cora on her sturdy mare in the lead, and beside her, Deputy Tom Reyes, his face bruised but resolute. "It's over," Bellamy Reyes yelled, his voice carrying over the wind. Arthur Bellamy, who had been observing from the rear, tried to turn his horse, but the Triple Bar Cowboys moved to block his path. His face, caught in the light of their lanterns, was a picture of disbelief and fury. On the path, Cole finally gained the upper hand. A single powerful blow sent Pike reeling backward. He stumbled, his arms flailing, and with a final, choked cry, he tumbled over the edge and disappeared into the snowy abyss. It was over. The law had returned. The community had come. Cole stood, breathing heavily, his knuckles bleeding, and turned back toward Evelyn on the bridge. And then the world seemed to fall away. The shudder of the snowslide and the violence of the fight had been too much for the ancient path. The ground beneath Evelyn's feet gave a sickening lurch. A long, dark crack appeared in the ice, and the section of the ledge where she stood crumbled. She cried out, her rifle flying from her grasp as she fell. Cole moved faster than he had ever moved in his life. He threw himself forward, his arms shooting out, his fingers just managing to close around her wrist as she went over the edge. Her weight nearly pulled him over with her. He dug his heels into the ice, his muscles straining, holding her dangling over the chasm. "Cole!" she screamed, her face a pale blur in the swirling snow. "I've got you," he grunted, the words torn from him. He could feel her hand slipping in his. He thought of Jimmy, of the rope, of his own helplessness. Not again, never again. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he hauled her up, pulling her over the edge and into the safety of the solid path. He collapsed, pulling her with him, holding her tight against his chest, shielding her from the wind with his own body. They lay there for a long moment, the only sound their own ragged breaths and the dying moan of the wind. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. He pushed a strand of snow-matted hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, broken whisper, a confession and a vow spoken into the heart of the storm. "You stood for me when the guns were out," he said, his breath warm against her cheek. "Evelyn, let me build you a home, a real home." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the dim light. In the midst of the cold, the violence, and the desolation, he had offered her the one thing she had thought was lost forever. Not just a house of wood and nails, but a promise of safety, of belonging, a sweet home. The world returned in pieces. First, the sound of the wind, no longer a scream, but a weary sigh. Then, the feeling of solid ground beneath her and the steady, reassuring weight of Cole's arms around her. Lanterns cast a moving, yellow light on the swirling snow, and the crunch of boots announced the arrival of the posse. Evelyn looked up and saw Deputy Tom Reyes, his face a roadmap of bruises, but his eyes clear and in command. Beside him, Cora sat on her horse like a monument, her shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. "It's all right, son," Cora's voice rumbled, directed at Cole. "It's over." Deputy Reyes knelt beside them, his gaze taking in their exhausted, half-frozen state. "Are you too hurt?" Cole shook his head, his grip on Evelyn not loosening. "We're fine. Bellamy?" "He's not going anywhere," Reyes said, gesturing back toward the mouth of the canyon where the Triple Bar Cowboys had Arthur Bellamy surrounded. The railroad man's fine coat was dusted with snow, his face a mask of disbelief. The power he had wielded like a weapon had evaporated, leaving him just a man, cold and cornered. Reyes then looked toward the chasm where Jasper Pike had fallen. And Pike, "He's gone," Cole said, the words flat and final. But one of the deputies who had scrambled down the less steep side of the ravine shouted up, "Found him. He's alive. Both legs are broken, but he's alive." A grim satisfaction settled over the group. A fall into the abyss would have been an ending. A capture was justice. They would haul him back to a town he could no longer terrorize, to face a law he could no longer subvert. As they made their way back through the canyon, Reyes explained how Cora, trusting her instincts that the storm was the kind of cover a snake like Pike would use, had ridden to the Triple Bar Ranch. She'd found Reyes there, having been left for dead in a line shack by Pike's men, only to be found by a Triple Bar rider. Her fiery words, combined with the sight of their battered deputy, had been enough to galvanize the cowboys. They weren't just saving the Heart Girl anymore. They were taking their town back. The blizzard broke at dawn. The wind died, and a profound, exhausted silence fell over a world blanketed in pristine white. The return to Cotton Ridge was slow, a funereal procession at first, which gradually transformed into a quiet triumph. They brought with them the end of a nightmare Arthur Bellamy in irons, and Jasper Pike tied to a makeshift sledge, his face a mask of pain and impotent fury. Bellamy tried to flee one last time, making a break for the telegraph office as they entered town, but one of the cowboys neatly lassoed him, pulling him off his feet into the muddy slush. A wire was sent to the U.S. Marshal in Miles City. Bellamy's railroad would not save him. It would only serve to transport him to prison. The aftermath was a time of quiet reckoning. For 2 days, the town seemed to be in a state of shock, digging out, tending to minor frostbite, and processing the violence that had erupted in their midst. The mood was somber, regretful. The burned-out grain storehouse stood as a black, skeletal monument to their fear. On the 3rd day, a small delegation walked the muddy track out to the Hart Ranch. It was Pete, the lanky cowboy, his hat clutched in his hands, and 2 of the town's most prominent women, who had been the quickest to whisper the rumors about Evelyn. They found her and Cole nailing a canvas tarp over the broken cabin door. Pete stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the muddy toes of his boots. "Miss Hart," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. We came to say we're sorry." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers, full of a shame that was plain and real. "We were scared, and we acted poorly. What you said, the night of the fire, you were right. We're supposed to live by each other out here. We forgot that." One of the women stepped forward, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "We were wrong to speak ill of you. You've been a better neighbor to this town than we have been to you." The apology hung in the clean, cold air, simple and unadorned. It couldn't erase the hurt, but it began to mend the rift. Later that day, Mr. Harris, the banker, rode out himself. He didn't dismount. He simply handed Evelyn a piece of paper. It was the original foreclosure notice. With a trembling hand, he struck a match and set the corner of the document on fire, holding it until the flames licked at his fingertips before dropping the black, curling ash into the snow. The forged loan agreement, he explained, along with Bellamy's ledgers that Cole had found, had been turned over to the deputy. The Hart debt was erased. The land was theirs, free and clear. That evening, the heavy work of healing began, not for the town, but for the 2 people who had borne the brunt of its storm, while Evelyn helped her mother with a warm broth. Cole sat at the small, scarred table, the very table he had upended to use as a barricade. He had taken out a pen and a precious sheet of paper. He was staring at it, the pen hovering over the blank page, his face a study in concentration and pain. He was finally ready to face the ghost that had haunted him for a decade. The words came slowly at first, stiff and clumsy, then flowed with a painful catharsis. He wrote not of his own heroism, but of his failure. He told a family he had never met about their son, Jimmy, about his quick laugh and his loyalty. He wrote of the injustice and of his own shame at having been a boy, powerless to stop it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it. He simply wanted them to know that their son had not been forgotten, that his memory was carried by a man who had tried and failed to be his friend. When he was done, he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He then took out the leather pouch where he kept his money, the profits from the cattle he had sold before the blizzard. He took out nearly all of it, leaving himself with just a few dollars, and tucked the thick wad of bills in with the letter. It wasn't payment. It was penance. It was the closing of a door on a long, dark hallway of his past. Evelyn, watching him from the doorway, understood that this was a private, sacred act. When he finally looked up, the haunted, restless quality she had always seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. He was no longer a drifter. He had found a place to stand still. Her own healing required a different kind of courage. Her mother had survived the ordeal, her constitution tougher than Evelyn had given her credit for. But the cold and the fear had taken a toll. Her cough was worse, her breathing more shallow. Evelyn knew the tonics and broths were no longer enough. She sat on the edge of her mother's bed, taking her thin, frail hand. "Mama," she said softly, "the doctor and Helena, the one I sent the wire to, we have the money now. The town, they're taking up a collection for us, to help." May's eyes filled with a familiar, stubborn fear. "I can't leave the ranch. Evelyn, this is our home. I won't be a charity case." "It's not charity, Mama. It's neighbors helping neighbors. It's what we're supposed to do," Evelyn said, her voice gentle but firm. "You gave me this home. You and Papa, you fought for it. Now you have to let me fight for you. Please, let's go to Helena. Let's see the doctor." She saw the battle in her mother's eyes, the pride warring with the exhaustion. And then, for the first time in a long time, she saw a flicker of hope. Her mother squeezed her hand and gave a slow, tired nod. The world began to thaw. The great, heavy blanket of snow receded, melting in streams of clear, cold water that fed the thirsty earth. And beneath the retreating white, a miracle occurred. The grass, pressed down and protected by the snow, was a vibrant, impossible green. The plains came back to life, not as the sun-scorched brown of summer, but with the fresh, hopeful blush of a second spring. They moved what they could from the damaged cabin to the barn, which was dry and sound. They set up a temporary kitchen in a clean, hay-scented corner. One evening, as the first green shoots of new life pushed through the mud outside, Evelyn lit the old oil lamp and placed it on a makeshift table. Its steady, golden flame flickered, casting a warm glow on the rough-hewn walls of their temporary home. It was a light that had seen them through the darkness, a symbol of a hope that had refused to be extinguished. It was no longer just a lamp in a cabin. It was the hearth fire for the home that was yet to be built. The first light of the sweet home that had been promised. The ashes of the old life were being washed away, and, in their place, something new and strong was beginning to grow. The journey to Helena was an act of faith. They traveled in a wagon borrowed from the Triple Bar Ranch, its bed lined with straw and blankets to make it as comfortable as possible for May. Cole drove, his quiet presence a steady reassurance against the vast, open miles. The town had seen them off with gifts of food, a small pouch of money for their expenses, and sincere wishes for May's recovery. It was a community transformed, the shared crisis having burned away the petty suspicions and forged a new, stronger bond in the ashes. They were gone for 2 months, a season of change both for May Hart and for the land she had left behind. In the clean, dry air of the mountains, under the care of a doctor whose knowledge extended beyond folk remedies and whiskey, May began to heal. The color returned to her cheeks. The rattling in her chest subsided, replaced by a slower, deeper breath. She would never be strong, but for the first time in years, she was not dying. While they were away, Cole began to build. He did not rebuild the old cabin, with its memories of fear and violence. He chose a new spot, a gentle rise a quarter-mile closer to town. It was far enough for privacy, but close enough, as he'd once heard Evelyn say, to hear the church bell on a clear Sunday morning. He was not alone in his work. The Triple Bar Cowboys, led by a newly humbled Pete, rode out twice a week. Not as hired hands, but as neighbors. They helped him fell the timber, plane the logs, and raise the frame. Cora came out with pots of stew and jugs of cold water, her gruff encouragement as essential as any hammer or saw. The town was not just repaying a debt. They were investing in their own future, helping to build a home for the family that had reminded them what a community was supposed to be. When Evelyn and May returned in the late summer, the frame of a new house stood on the rise, its fresh-cut pine glowing in the afternoon sun. It was larger than the old cabin, with a wide, welcoming porch and 2 large windows facing east. May stared at it, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that were not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. The work continued through the golden days of autumn. Cole was a meticulous builder, his movements economical and precise. Evelyn worked beside him, learning the heft of a hammer, the scent of sawdust, the deep satisfaction of seeing a wall rise, straight and true. She saw a new side of him, a patient, creative force that found its expression not in wandering, but in making. He was a man building his own piece, one nail at a time. The house became a living thing, a testament to their shared future. He saved one window for last, the one in the small bedroom that would be May's. He built the frame with extra care, sanding the pine until it was smooth as silk. He set it perfectly square, ensuring it caught the very first rays of the morning sun. So your mother can breathe in the new day, he said to Evelyn, his voice quiet, the words a simple, heartfelt fulfillment of a promise. The day they moved in, the house was not yet finished, but it was a home. The air smelled of clean wood and fresh paint. Evelyn's first act was not to unpack their meager belongings, but to take out the small wooden box that held her father's letters. She chose the one she had read aloud to Cole, the one that spoke of a sweet home where the scent of baking bread would be stronger than the smell of gun oil. With a small tack, she pinned the delicate, yellowed paper to the wall beside the new kitchen stove, a silent blessing from the man who had first dreamed this dream. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet labor. The railroad finally arrived, its iron tracks glinting in the sun, its whistle a lonely, mournful sound that spoke of a changing world. It brought new people, new goods, and new challenges, as they knew it would. But the foundation they had built was not of wood or stone alone. It was built on the hard-won bedrock of justice, trust, and the unwavering belief that a community was a group of people who chose to live by and for each other. The fear that had once held Cotton Ridge in its grip had been replaced by a cautious, resilient hope. One evening, as the last light of a perfect autumn day painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Evelyn and Cole sat together on the porch swing he had built. The gentle creak of the ropes was the only sound, besides the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of a stray cow. The town was a scatter of warm, yellow lights below them, and from their own window, the steady glow of their father's oil lamp shone out into the twilight. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, a comfortable, easy gesture that had become as natural as breathing. She looked out at the vast, peaceful prairie, at the land that had tested them, threatened them, and ultimately had given them a home. A soft smile touched her lips. "I remember that day in the canyon," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "A young girl, thinking she was so tough, stood up to shield a lone cowboy from bandits, all amidst the red dust and the gunfire." She paused, turning her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. She never imagined, not for a moment, that he would be the one to build her this sweet home. Cole looked down at her, his stormy gray eyes soft and full of a love that needed no grand pronouncements. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand gently touching her cheek. "Not for you, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and certain. "For us." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you all. So please comment with where you are listening from. Be sure to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.